Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. When I first moved into Oakwood Estates, I thought it would be a peaceful place to settle down after years of military service. I'd spent 15 years in the Marines doing tours in Afghanistan and Iraq before an IED took my right leg below the knee. After medical discharge with a Purple Heart, I just wanted a quiet place where my wife and I could build our life together. The house we found seemed perfect, a modest 3-bedroom in a well-maintained neighborhood with good schools nearby. The HOA fees weren't too outrageous, and the community looked clean. I even met a few neighbors during the open house who seemed friendly enough. So we signed the papers and felt pretty good about our decision. The first few months were quiet. I settled into my new job as an IT consultant, working mostly from home. My wife started teaching at the local high school, and we fell into a comfortable routine. I was still adjusting to civilian life and my prosthetic, but things were going well. Then came Memorial Day. As a veteran, this day holds special significance for me. I decided to put up a flagpole in our front yard to display the American flag. Nothing massive, just a simple 20-foot pole that I installed myself. I made sure it was securely anchored and looked good. I followed proper flag etiquette with a light to illuminate it at night so I wouldn't have to take it down. It was important to me to honor those who didn't make it back. 3 days after I installed the flagpole, I got my first notice from the HOA. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you have installed an unauthorized structure, flagpole, on your property. According to HOA bylaw 7.3, all external modifications must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to installation. Please remove the structure within 7 days or face a fine of $100 per day until compliance is achieved. I was annoyed, but not shocked. I'd heard stories about HOA being sticklers for rules. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I went to the HOA office to submit a retroactive request for approval. The office was in a small building near the community pool, staffed by a middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl. "Hi, I'm here about the flagpole notice," I said, sliding the paper across the desk to her. "I'd like to submit a request for approval." She barely looked up from her computer. "You should have done that before installation. Now you need to remove it and then apply." "I understand I should have applied first," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I'm hoping we can work something out. It's just a flagpole, and it's important to me as a veteran." At the mention of being a veteran, she glanced at me briefly, her eyes flicking down to my prosthetic leg visible below my shorts. "Rules are rules," she said flatly. "The board doesn't make exceptions." I took a deep breath. Could I at least meet with the board to explain my situation? "The next meeting is in 3 weeks. You can come then, but the flagpole needs to come down immediately." I left with a form to request a hearing and a growing sense of frustration. My wife suggested I take down the flagpole temporarily to avoid the fines, but something in me refused to do it. This wasn't about being stubborn. It was about standing up for something that mattered to me. The daily fine notices started arriving, and I filed them away while waiting for my hearing date. I did some research on HOA regulations and found that several states had Freedom to Display the American Flag Act laws that limited HOA ability to restrict flag displays. Unfortunately, our state wasn't one of them, but I still felt I had a reasonable case. When the hearing date finally arrived, I dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, brought my documentation, and prepared to make my case calmly and rationally. The board consisted of 5 people, all homeowners themselves. Thompson, the president, a retired banker with a perpetual tan. Lisa, a real estate agent with a smile that never reached her eyes. Roger, who never spoke unless directly addressed. Sarah, who seemed reasonable. And Martinez, who looked bored by the whole proceeding. Thompson called my case first. "We're here to address the unauthorized installation of a flagpole at 1274 Oakwood Drive. The homeowner has requested a hearing." I stood up and introduced myself. "Thank you for meeting with me. I understand I should have sought approval before installing the flagpole, and for that, I apologize. However, I'd like to request retroactive approval. The pole is well constructed, doesn't interfere with any utilities, and is a respectful display of the American flag, which is important to me as a veteran." I handed out photos showing the flagpole from different angles, demonstrating that it was professional looking and proportional to the house. Lisa spoke first. "While we appreciate your service, the rules clearly state that all structures must be approved before installation. If we make an exception for you, we'd have to make exceptions for everyone." "I'm not asking for the rules to be ignored," I replied. "I'm asking for them to be applied reasonably. I'm happy to submit all the necessary paperwork now." Thompson shook his head. "The issue isn't just the paperwork. Freestanding flagpoles aren't permitted in Oakwood Estates. Only small, house-mounted flag brackets are allowed. This was the first I'd heard of this specific restriction. Could you show me where in the bylaws it specifies that? I've reviewed them and didn't see anything prohibiting flagpoles specifically. There was an uncomfortable silence as Thompson flipped through his binder. Finally, Martinez spoke up. It's under the general structures prohibition. Anything not explicitly permitted is considered prohibited. That seemed like a stretch, but I kept my cool. In that case, I'd like to formally request that the board consider amending the rules to allow tasteful, well-maintained flagpoles for displaying the American flag. Many communities have such provisions, especially in recognition of veterans. Sarah, who had been quiet, finally spoke. I think that's a reasonable request. Perhaps we could draft guidelines for appropriate flagpole specifications. Thompson shot her a look that could have frozen lava. The architectural guidelines were carefully developed to maintain property values and community aesthetics. We're not going to change them for one homeowner. The discussion went back and forth for nearly 30 minutes, but it became clear that Thompson and Lisa had no intention of budging. Roger never spoke, Martinez seemed indifferent, and Sarah's attempt at compromise was quickly shut down. Finally, Thompson delivered the verdict. Your request is denied. The flagpole must be removed within 7 days. The accumulated fines to date stand at $2,100 and will continue to accrue until the structure is removed. I left the meeting feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. That night, my wife and I had a long talk about our options. She was concerned about the mounting fines, but she also understood why this mattered to me. Maybe we should consult a lawyer, she suggested. This doesn't seem right. The next day, I called a law firm that specialized in property disputes. The consultation was free, and the lawyer Jenkins seemed genuinely interested in my case. HOA have a lot of power, he explained, but they're not unlimited. Let's take a look at their actual bylaws and CC and Rs. After reviewing all my documents, Jenkins spotted something interesting. The bylaw they're citing about structures doesn't actually define flagpoles as prohibited structures, and there's nothing in here about only allowing house-mounted brackets. They're overreaching. This gave me some hope, but Jenkins cautioned me that fighting an HOA could be costly and time-consuming. He suggested I try one more attempt at negotiation before pursuing legal action. Armed with this information, I sent a formal letter to the board requesting a second hearing and clearly outlining the lack of specific prohibition on flagpoles in their own documents. I also cited several court cases where HOA had lost similar disputes. Their response was swift and shocking. Instead of addressing my points, they escalated dramatically. The new notice claimed that my continued defiance constituted a pattern of non-compliance that triggered a special provision in the bylaws. According to them, this allowed them to issue a comprehensive compliance penalty of $250,000, with a lien to be placed on my home if not paid within 30 days. When I showed this to Jenkins, even he was stunned. This is completely outrageous. There's no way this would hold up in court. They're trying to intimidate you. At this point, I knew I was dealing with something beyond normal HOA strictness. This felt personal and vindictive, and I wasn't going to back down. Jenkins agreed to take my case, and we planned a two-pronged approach: legal action and public pressure. While he prepared to challenge the legality of both the flagpole restriction and the absurd $250,000 penalty, I reached out to a local news station that did segments on community issues. The reporter Sanchez was immediately interested. A disabled veteran being fined $250,000 for displaying the American flag? That's definitely a story we'd cover. The day after I spoke with Sanchez, a news van pulled up outside my house. They filmed the flagpole, interviewed me on my front lawn, and even tried to get comments from neighbors. Most neighbors expressed shock at the size of the fine, though a few nervously declined to comment, clearly worried about their own standing with the HOA. Thompson, the board president, refused an on-camera interview but sent a written statement claiming they were simply enforcing the rules equally for all residents, and that the large fine reflected the seriousness of repeatedly ignoring community standards. The story aired that evening, and the reaction was immediate. By the next morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Veterans groups offered support, neighbors I'd never spoken to stopped by to express solidarity, and several lawyers called offering pro bono representation, though I was already working with Jenkins. The most interesting call came from Sarah, the board member who had suggested a compromise. "I wanted you to know that I never voted for that ridiculous fine," she said, her voice low as if worried about being overheard. Thompson and Lisa pushed it through in a special session with just Roger present. The three of them voted yes, which was technically a majority. "That doesn't sound legal," I said. "It's not," she replied. There's supposed to be proper notice for all board members before voting on significant actions. I've documented everything, and I'm willing to provide a statement if needed. This was a game changer. Not only was the fine itself questionable, but the process used to impose it was potentially a violation of their own rules. Meanwhile, the story had spread beyond our local news. A national veterans organization picked it up, and suddenly my fight with the HOA was trending on social media. A hashtag #LetHimFly started gaining traction, and people from across the country were calling out the HOA for what they saw as un-American behavior. The pressure continued to build. The HOA's office was flooded with emails and calls. Several homeowners reported that they were planning to fly flags in solidarity, directly challenging the HOA to fine them all. The community Facebook page was filled with angry posts, many from residents who'd had their own run-ins with the board. 7 days after the news story broke, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It stated that after careful reconsideration, they had decided to temporarily suspend the fines while they reviewed their policies regarding patriotic displays. The $250,000 penalty was not mentioned at all. Jenkins advised me not to celebrate yet. This is just them trying to quiet the public outcry. They're hoping the attention will die down, and then they can come after you again. He was right to be cautious. 2 weeks later, when the media attention had somewhat subsided, I received another notice. This one stated that while they were still reviewing their flagpole policy, the accumulated daily fines, now over $3,000, were still in effect and would need to be paid. That's when we decided to go on the offensive. Jenkins filed a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, abuse of power, and violation of their own governing documents. He included Sarah's statement about the improper board vote and added a demand for punitive damages. The same day the lawsuit was filed, we also sent evidence of potentially fraudulent financial practices to every homeowner in the community. During our investigation, we had discovered that the landscaping company and the maintenance firm being paid from HOA dues were both owned by shell companies that traced back to Thompson and Lisa. They were essentially paying themselves with HOA funds, likely at inflated rates. The response was even more dramatic than the initial news story. Homeowners were outraged, not just about my situation, but about the possibility that their fees had been misused for years. An emergency community meeting was called, not by the board but by a group of angry residents. The meeting was held in the community center, which was packed beyond capacity. Thompson and Lisa didn't show up, but Roger, Sarah, and Martinez did. Roger looked terrified, Martinez seemed resigned, and Sarah was actually smiling slightly. A homeowner who was also a retired judge volunteered to moderate the meeting. People took turns expressing their frustrations with the board, many sharing their own stories of excessive fines and arbitrary rule enforcement. The mood was tense but unified. Almost everyone agreed that the current board had abused their power. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to fly the flag that I and many others fought for. But in standing up for myself, I seem to have uncovered bigger issues that affect all of us. This community deserves better leadership. The crowd erupted in applause. By the end of the meeting, a vote of no confidence in the current board had passed overwhelmingly, and a special election was scheduled for the following month. Thompson and Lisa apparently saw the writing on the wall. Before the election could take place, both resigned from the board, citing personal reasons and time constraints. An audit was ordered for the HOA's financial records, and the preliminary findings confirmed our suspicions. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been directed to companies connected to Thompson and Lisa over the past 5 years. The new board was elected with a mandate for transparency and fairness. Their first official act was to formally approve my flagpole and cancel all associated fines. Their second was to update the community guidelines to specifically allow properly maintained flagpoles for American flags, with reasonable specifications for height and installation. Jenkins advised me to continue with the lawsuit despite these positive changes. The personal stress and financial threat they put you under shouldn't go unaddressed, he argued. I agreed, though I made it clear that I wasn't looking to bankrupt the HOA itself, which would only hurt my neighbors. The case never made it to court. Thompson and Lisa, facing potential criminal charges for the financial improprieties, agreed to a settlement that included a public apology, payment of my legal fees, and a personal penalty of $25,000 each, a tidy reversal of the $250,000 they had tried to extract from me. I donated the $50,000 to a veteran support organization that helps with housing issues for disabled vets. It's been a year since this all happened. The flagpole still stands in my yard, now joined by many others throughout the neighborhood. The new HOA board operates with transparency and genuine community input. Property values have actually increased, despite Thompson's dire warnings about flagpoles destroying the community aesthetic. More importantly, I've gotten to know my neighbors in a way I never would have otherwise. The fight brought many of us together, and we've maintained those connections. We have regular community cookouts, and last Memorial Day, we organized a neighborhood event honoring veterans, with flags lining every street. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about winning, it's about building something better in the process. What started as a personal battle over a flagpole ended up transforming an entire community. And every morning when I raise that flag, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for. The strangest part? I got a letter last month from Thompson's wife. He passed away from a heart attack, and while cleaning out his office, she found a box of military medals. Turns out he had served in Vietnam, but never talked about it. She thought I might want to know. It made me wonder if his resistance to my flagpole had been about something deeper than just HOA rules, but that's a mystery I'll never solve. Instead, I focus on the community we've built, one that honors service while respecting everyone's right to peaceful enjoyment of their homes. And when new people move in, the welcome packet now includes a copy of the flag display guidelines written clearly and reasonably, with none of the gotcha clauses and hidden penalties of the old regime. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your opponent, it's creating something better from the conflict. My flagpole stands not just as a symbol of patriotism now, but as a reminder that one person willing to take a stand can make a difference for many. The next one is a pro-revenge story. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come into work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question, since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that, only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire! I'm not ready to retire!" Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian Police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. to rub salt in Jane's wounds. The next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, retires, made sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.